Perfect. So today we're going to go over bench press, guys. Obviously, we're going to think about it in two dynamics. One's going to be from a strength perspective, and the other one's going to be from a hypertrophy perspective. So there's a lot of carryover in between the two, but we just want to think about the conceptual ideas and how to build one over the other. So when you're thinking about bench press in general, you want to think about how the chest line, the fibers of the chest align with the humerus in the arm, and then align with the bar that you're actually going to lift. And this is going to be more from a hypertrophy standpoint. You want the fibers to start aligned as much as you can with the humerus, right? So if we're here, you're going to have that line of force production is going to be equivalent to everything going straight across. The more you tuck, the more that line is going to be into the anterior delt, so you're not going to get as much pec as possible. So you want it between about a 45 degrees and a 90 degrees in order for you to get as much pec involvement and recruitment as you can. And then from there, you want to think about how can I be the strongest possible. And the strongest is usually going to be with your joints and your bones stacked on top of each other. So if you have your wrist stacked on top, or your knuckle stacked on top of your wrist, which goes to your elbow joint, right? And you want to keep that as much as you can underneath the bar, right? If you have a super wide grip, you're going to have a little bit more deviation from that. But for most people, to be as strong as possible, you want all that stuff to be stacked on top of each other, right? And then the next thing you want to think about is where those pec fibers align with the bar when you're in the bottom position. So whenever you get down into your arch position, you want to think about having your arch to be put in such a way that where the bottom of your pec is also in line with the bar as well, right? So an arch here is going to allow your pec fibers to be aligned with the bar when you take it out and you come down, right? But if you overarch too much, then that's going to create less range of motion, which is not going to be optimal for as much hypertrophy as possible. But if you go flat as well, right, and your rib cage isn't as pronounced as mine, the flatter you are, the less likely you are to get some of that lower pec recruitment as well. So you want to think about rib cage position, where your line, and how that rib cage kind of tips up and goes down with the bar, and how your arch is, right? So when you're thinking about the arch, you want to think about being able to do that in a manner to where your pec fibers start to line up, but you're not so arched that you diminish the range of motion, so that you don't get it in the fully lengthened position, right? And that's going to be more for muscle hypertrophy. When you're thinking about trying to train for strength, the less range of motion you're going to have, the better that's going to be. So you want your arch to be as much as you can, but you want that arch to be more through your thoracic spine instead of your lumbar spine. So if you watch any good bench presser or good archer, they're going to be more through here, trying to get their arch as much as they can through there instead of through their lower back, which can cause a lot of cramping, cause a lot of spinal compression issues. So you want to avoid that as much as you can. So you want to think about arch from your T-spine, right? And we've done some drills for that, thinking about what can stabilize, right? So if you do more of an arch through your T-spine, that's going to allow things to stack a little bit better onto your traps, which when you drive into the bench, that's going to give you better ability to produce as much force as possible within that movement pattern. So you want to think in terms of how do we create as much stability as possible, and how can we get that bar to not lessen as you're going down. You want to think about trying to roll the bar into your chest. So a lot of issues that we have is a lot of people will come down with the bench press, and as they go here, they get a little bit flatter and a little bit flatter each time. So what you want to think about is trying to pull that bar down into you. Think like you're trying to drive your scapula into each other, right? And then as you're pressing up, you want to think about how does my chest contract as much as possible. A lot of people just think about that up and down motion. You want to think about driving your bicep, your humerus into your chest as much as you can on the way up, and that way you activate as many pec fibers as possible. And then from there, right, you want to think, how can I create as much stability as I can? Remember that the lats, the triceps, the biceps stabilize the shoulder as much as you can. So from there, knowing that the lats connects to your humerus, you want to think about driving that humerus into your lat in order for you to get as much stability in that movement as possible. So the more stability you have, the more force you can produce. So once that bar is in your hand, right, it's going to look more here. And then from there, keeping in line with everything that we talked about in the beginning, making sure that those pec fibers align as much as possible. You're going to be here with the movement,
really trying to squeeze that humerus and get those lats as tight as possible. You don't want to be overly tucked to do it, because if you over tuck, then you're going to come back out. Right? So we want to keep that elbow underneath the bar as much as we can. Right? Squeezing through the lats and then driving back. And it's going to come down to your ability to really think about trying to drive that lat down with minimal arm movement as possible. If you're focusing on trying to squeeze like that to drive that lat down, that's going to only allow you to facilitate triceps and very little lat at the bottom of the movement. So you want to think about trying to just really squeeze, depress that scapula, depress your traps as much as you can, and that's going to allow the lat to be activated without messing up that bar path and your elbow position and the things that are going to allow you to create as much force as you can. Right? And then you want to create as much stability as possible within your feet and your hip and that range of motion. Right? So you're thinking about trying to grab the ground with your feet and then trying to adduct as much as you can, right, out. And that's going to allow your hips to stay flat, and that's going to allow for when you do drive and use that force production, that it's going to be able to flow all the way through. So when you're thinking about the bench press, you're going to have your legs set up, right? Not too worried about where your hip position is and where your feet are. It's whatever's comfortable for you. But the biggest thing you want to think about is if you're on a flat position and your legs are driving out, you want to drive that way to create momentum and create that leg drive. Now, if you're tucked, you want to think the opposite, and you're trying to squeeze in and trying to drive your heels together, right? So this one, you're trying to drive out, right? Because your legs are flat and you push that way. Here, you're trying to drive your heels together and in, squeezing your adductors as much as you can, right? And then that's going to allow for that same force alignment, same horizontal drive. You never want to think about a vertical drive, but if your feet are flat, you're trying to push out like that to create stability. And if your feet are in, you're trying to kick your heels together to create that stability. You really try to squeeze the bench with your adductors. And then from there, as you go into the press, a lot of times you'll have people who press and they'll press to push the bar away from them. You want to think about trying to push your back into the ground as much as you can, and that's going to allow you to keep that rib cage flared up, and that's going to allow for you to have as big of a bench press and as big of an arch as possible without losing that position. And then it's just a matter of juxtaposed force. So you're going to drive into the ground as hard as you're trying to push that weight off you, and that way you're able to maintain that position. If you're pushing this way and you're finding yourself flattening out while you press, that's because you're trying to press the bar off you and you're trying to get flatten out just a little bit each time you do that. So you want to make sure that and that's why that T-spine mobility is going to be very important, so that when you do drive, you're driving into your traps. If you're driving into your lumbar, then that's going to cause you to flatten out a lot. So you're trying to drive in there, and then from there, you want to think, if my grip is really wide, I want to press more in a straight line, because that's going to allow for the best possible range of motion in order for you to complete that lift. But the closer your grip is, the more you're going to press in a J-hook manner. So you're going to think about trying to drive it back slightly over your chest. But the same idea goes for touching with the bar path and everything else. You want to make sure that your elbows are in line as much as you can with the bar. So if you're watching your bench video or your client's bench videos and their elbows are tucked, and then when they go to press, they immediately flare out, that's probably a good sign that they're tucking too much within that movement pattern. And then also too, if they're having more of a vertical leg drive, that could be that they're not engaging their quads and their glutes and really trying to think about those cues to squeeze the adductors or drive them out. So those are the things that you want to think when troubleshooting those type of lifts, if those things are occurring. And then from there, match this up with the glenohumeral video so that you can find out ways to create stability through the serratus anterior, through the lat, through the tricep and bicep. But this is kind of just a general guideline. So you want to think in terms of hypertrophy, you want everything to be aligned as much as possible. And the further you can get that elbow joint up, the more disadvantageous you can make that movement, the more pec you're going to be able to recruit. But when it comes to a powerlifting, you want to think about where you can produce the most force, and that's usually going to be a little bit more down in that between 45 and 90 degree angle. So just making sure that the idea is create as much stability as we can through a depression of the scapula and also depression of your traps to allow you to stabilize the bar, right? The more stability you have, the more force we can produce. And then if you're trying to be more in that hypertrophy thing, you want to think to have a little bit more of a scapular protraction and retraction within that movement. So you're thinking about trying to retract it down. Then as you go to press and you're driving your bicep into your chest, you're going to think about maybe slightly pulling that scapula out a little bit, which is why maybe the bench press isn't the best thing for muscle hypertrophy. Dumbbells could be a little bit more advantageous, or machines for that matter, because as you move that scapula, you start to lose stability within that movement pattern, right? So with bench press, as far as a power athlete goes, you're thinking about pulling that down, depressing, and just keeping that in a fixed position as much as possible. That way, anytime there's a deviation within that fixed position, you're going to lose your ability to produce force and your ability to lift as much weight as you possibly can. So those are the considerations to think about within the bench press as far as trying to build hypertrophy or trying to build strength. And then you're just going to adjust based accordingly for that. If you're a power lifter, most of the time you're going to be in a powerlifting thing, but you can take those dynamics and put them into like a dumbbell work or something like that to get as much hypertrophy out as possible. I would never recommend for a strength athlete trying to acquire skill to do a bench press that's going to be more advantageous for muscle hypertrophy, but your assistance work like your dumbbells and things like that won't mess up the skill acquisition portion can be allowed to facilitate more of a hypertrophy stimulus. So things to consider when you're applying this type of stuff for your athletes and for yourself.